Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the debut webisode of Office 365 Pulse with Scot Hillier. My name is Dan Holm. I'm the CEO and co-founder of IT Unity, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to enjoy the first opportunity to share in the wisdom of one of the most expert and level-headed and clearly guided voices in the dev community. Also happens to be the lead of our development community on IT Unity, and I'm lucky enough to call him a very good friend, Mr. Scot Hillier. And Scott, let me hand it off to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Very nice. Great. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our inaugural episode of Dev Pulse, Office 365 Dev Pulse. Our program is sponsored by Microsoft, so we want to do a big shout out right away to Microsoft for all the support they give us here at IT Unity. Lyman, why don't we go ahead and switch over to our other presentation layout here. And everybody should be able to see our slides and my happy face here and follow along below. Before we get started, just a little bit of news here. We had promised to have Andrew Connell with us on this episode. Unfortunately, Andrew got laryngitis, which it makes me smile a bit because I think the reason he got it was from presenting too much. So he's in high demand, I'm sure, doing a lot of presentations. And so a little bit of laryngitis. So he's not going to be with us this week. He will be with us in 2 weeks, but not to worry. I'm going to press on and cover some information about Angular and SharePoint development that we can all use. Oh, great. Let's go ahead and dig in then. So a little bit of our agenda, what we're going to cover for this inaugural episode. I'm going to talk a little bit about news and updates, so what's going on, some important things that you guys should know about. And then we're going to dig into some technical material here and talk specifically about Angular and SharePoint. Again, when Andrew was going to be with me, the idea was that he was going to talk about creating Office add-ins and specifically using Angular with Office add-ins. So to sort of keep with that theme, I'm going to talk about using Angular in SharePoint development, but I'm going to look at some different ways of using Angular in SharePoint development so I don't steal any thunder from him when he shows up a couple of weeks from now. All right, great. Just a couple of things for the news and updates category before we dig into anything technical here. Again, our next show is going to be on August 18th, so mark your calendar 2 weeks from now, in which AC is going to come back and talk about Angular and Office add-ins. Hopefully 2 weeks is enough to get over the laryngitis and move on. A couple of other things here, just some other shows that you might be interested in that may not have heard of yet. First is the Office Dev Show. The Office Dev Show every Wednesday on Channel 9. They're in about maybe the 4th or 5th episode now with Sonia Kuptiev, who is covering all things Office development from the Microsoft perspective as well. So a lot of great people there. It's a video-based like this one as well. So you get to see demos and code and talk to experts in the field as well. Vesa was on with her previously talking about patterns and practices, so that's a type of quality thing going on with the Office Dev Show over on Channel 9. Also, we want to send a big shout out to Jeremy Fake for the Office 365 Developer Podcast. The Office 365 Developer Podcast is celebrating its 1 year now, so it's 1 year anniversary, with about 20,000 people listening to Jeremy's podcast on a weekly basis. So if you haven't checked out the Office 365 Developer Podcast, you want to do that as well. And lastly, I want to point you to the Office 365 Developer Program. Every time I talk about Office 365 development, I make sure I point everybody to dev.office.com. Dev.office.com is the spot that you want to start at for all things Office development. And for all of these things, and indeed all the resources that I'll present today, we have links to every single one of them available to you in the window. You can see the Office 365 Dev Pulse, Dev Show, Podcast, and Office 365 Developer Program links right there. Should be able to go ahead and click them yourselves and open up your browser. If I click them while I'm presenting, it opens up a browser for everyone. So I'm not going to do that for you right now, but if you have interest in those or you want to follow up with them afterwards, the links are all available to you right there. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and talk about different things that we can do with Angular and SharePoint development. And I'm going to talk about 3 different scenarios where Angular and SharePoint intersect in nice ways. The first one is JavaScript Injection. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call implicit OAuth Flow. And finally, I'm going to talk about merging JSLink and Angular together. So first, let's start off with JavaScript Injection, probably the easiest one of the three that we'll talk about. But when it comes to creating solutions in SharePoint these days, everybody knows that we're doing more and more client-side development. And so client-side development means more and more JavaScript that we're writing. And the easiest way to get JavaScript involved in your SharePoint solutions is just simply to inject some JavaScript into the site. So how can this be done? Well, probably the simplest way to do it is to just grab the web parts, right? Just have the JavaScript web part, put it on a page, and go ahead and write some JavaScript. But you could also do things like write JavaScript in an add-in, and you can also use user custom actions called ScriptLink user custom actions to inject JavaScript in. And you can also use JSLink to inject JavaScript into a site. And the point here for Office developers is there are a number of different ways to inject JavaScript directly into a site that don't necessarily involve creating a big application or building out an add-in. The other thing that we see when people are using JavaScript injection is that you often find that non-developers are doing this as well. So when I started off talking about this, I said, hey, you could just take a web part, write some JavaScript in it, drop it in the page, and you've just injected some JavaScript into your SharePoint site. So what we're seeing is some challenges with JavaScript injection because you have power users who are creating maybe simple web parts. You have developers that are doing add-ins. Maybe they're also doing script links. You have people that want JSLink to modify their web parts. And all of these folks are referencing various JavaScript libraries. So let's say, for example, we're interested in using Angular in our site. Well, maybe we have some references to Angular core libraries that can be found in web parts, in script links, and in JSLink files. And what that leads to is multiple references to these same JavaScript libraries over and over again. I had a colleague I was talking to about this problem, and he told me that he was hired to do an assessment of a SharePoint installation and this particular issue with JavaScript references. And he said that he found over a dozen references to exactly the same JavaScript library on one page alone. So even though we're all doing more and more client-side stuff, we're kind of bumping into each other as everybody's trying to do references to these JavaScript libraries. And not only do you have multiple references to these libraries, but you have references to other versions of libraries as well. So maybe somebody has referenced Angular 1.3, somebody else Angular 1.4. And then we could have problems too where people are including references with JSLink, and those references are affecting multiple web parts on the page. So the key takeaway here for us as Office 365 developers, specifically trying to use something like Angular, is that we want to make sure that we have a reference to Angular that's usable and that isn't different versions or multiple references. And so the tool I'm going to introduce to you first for the Office developer interested in using Angular is something called the CDN Manager. The CDN Manager. The idea here behind the CDN Manager was to create an add-in that you could use to manage the references to JavaScript libraries. And so you could centrally set references to JavaScript libraries and make them available throughout a SharePoint site so that from the power user through the full-scale developer, you would never have to set those libraries in your own application or web part. It would be set for you. And you can see here in the slide, we have some simple code that uses the CDN Manager. Basically, the way that we built out this product was so that there is one object known as the CDN Manager object, and really just one method for you to worry about, which you can see here is the getScript method. And what you do is reference the libraries that you care about, in this case, jQuery and Knockout, and then you'll receive a callback function when those libraries are loaded. In this way, you never actually have to set a script reference. You get the reference by simply calling the getScript method of the CDN Manager. The CDN Manager was created by myself and a couple of other MVPs that all had input into it to solve this particular problem. And what I'd like to do now is actually show you how to use the tool and where you can get it. So let's go ahead and shift to sharing my screen. I need that screen share layout. Here it comes. Great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so for our first demo, what I'm going to do is go into an Office 365 tenancy here. So I've got my developer Office 365 tenancy, and I already have installed the Content Delivery Network Manager, the CDN Manager. And if I click on the CDN Manager, we can see the CDN Manager app. And what the CDN Manager app has is just a list of various JavaScript libraries that you might want to reference. So you can see that we've got a reference here to jQuery, we've got an Angular reference right here, Knockout and Bootstrap. And what you do is inside of the manager, you can specify which of these libraries is active. So if we look over on the right here, you can see that we have an active check mark next to the Angular library. We can click on the Manage CDN List button here, and it will take us to a list where we can add or edit our own CDN entries. So this is nothing more than a standard SharePoint list. And you can see that we have a URL to the CDN that you're interested in, a flag indicating whether or not it's active, and then dependencies. So for example, we've said here that Knockout is dependent on jQuery, and the CDN Manager will make sure that jQuery is loaded before it tries to load Knockout. In our case, however, we're kind of focused on Angular here. So if we look at the Angular library down here at the bottom, you can see that we've got Angular active, and it's the only library that's active. So Angular 1.3 is active. If I go back to the CDN Manager, we'll notice here in the general layout that what it does is it shows me what's activated, but it also goes out on the internet and it validates the CDNs. So it will go looking for each of the CDNs that you list and make sure that that's an actual valid CDN. Once you've selected which ones you want to inject, all you have to do is click the Inject Active CDNs button. And then what happens is the reference to that CDN will be available throughout the entire SharePoint site so that nobody ever has to set that reference again. We can actually see this in action by going to the home page of my site here, and you'll see that we've got a little AngularJS script web part right here that just has my name. I'm going to go ahead and place this page in edit mode, and then I'm going to take the script web part here and place it in edit mode. And then we'll say we'd like to edit the snippet, and we'll be able to actually see the code here. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and just copy this out, and we'll run over here to Visual Studio, and I'll go ahead and put in a new HTML file so we can see it a little bigger. Okay, so here's the code that's actually in that script web part. If you're familiar with Angular, then you'll recognize the first part up here is just the HTML for the Angular app. So data-ng-app is saying I have an app called my app. The controller for this div is my CTRL, my controller. And then I'm using the mustache syntax here for the first name and last name. If we go down to the script part, you'll see that once again we're calling that one object that's created by the CDN Manager called CDN Manager, and that one method getScript. And we're passing in the name of the script as it appears in the CDN Manager list that we would like to ensure is loaded. The CDN Manager will ensure that that Angular is loaded, and then call my callback function. And here in my callback function, I set up a new Angular module. I define my controller, and then inside here, I set the scope variables first name and last name to Scot Hillier, which is why, if we go back to the page, save it out, we can see that when this runs, there's the mustaches right there. And then when it runs, we can see it picks up Scot Hillier. So indeed, this is an Angular application running inside of a script web part. So you can get the CDN Manager from the Patterns and Practices GitHub repository. And again, we've got a reference for you available that comes along with this presentation to go ahead and click on that and take you right to the GitHub repository. Okay, let's run on back to the slides and look at a couple of other things. The second way I want to talk to you about integrating Angular development with your SharePoint development is through what's known as implicit OAuth Flow. So OAuth has become quite a big deal for us as Office developers because OAuth is what the security protocol that allows us to have an add-in do something on our behalf without having to give up our username and password. Increasingly, as we utilize untrusted add-ins and apps and applications on the internet, and we're orchestrating them to work with our own applications, we need to have a mechanism where we can trust other applications to do work for us without us actually having to give up our username and password. So I always use the example of having Facebook tweet for you. If you would like to have Facebook tweet for you every single time you update your Facebook status, then what you would have to do prior to OAuth is you would have to give Facebook your username and password. And then Facebook could tweet for you. Of course, not only could Facebook tweet for you, but it could do other things like change your password. So you really just gave complete control of your Twitter account to Facebook. Now, maybe you trust Mark Zuckerberg that much, but I'm not sure that I do. So I would prefer a mechanism that allows Facebook to tweet for me without me actually having to give up my username and password. And today, using OAuth, you have that experience where instead of giving up your password, you're presented with what's called a consent dialog. And the consent dialog says, hey, would you like for Facebook to be able to tweet for you? And basically what happens is Twitter recognizes Facebook and that you've given it that one right just to tweet, not to change your password or anything else. And now Facebook can tweet for you and only tweet for you. So OAuth is an important protocol for us as Office developers. But when it comes to Angular, we've had some challenges using OAuth because Angular is all JavaScript, right? So the challenge is that JavaScript is not a secure language for defending secrets. So the standard OAuth flow demands that you present a client ID, a unique identifier for the application, plus a client secret, sort of a password for the application identity. And that password, that client secret that's required under standard OAuth flow, really isn't safe if you put it in a JavaScript variable. If you put something in a JavaScript variable, you may as well just post it on a billboard on the highway because anybody can get to it. So what we need is a mechanism that allows us to engage in trust with other applications, not have to give up our password to do it, and is secure for JavaScript. And so the next tool that you care about is something called AngularjS, Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript, AngularjS. AngularjS was specifically introduced for Angular and for using OAuth implicit flow with JavaScript-based applications. AngularJS is really built with Angular in mind, and that's an important thing to understand, is that it comes with two libraries, one for implementing the flow and the other specifically to work with Angular. It supports signing users into Azure Active Directory. So a key thing here is that in order to use AngularJS, we're assuming that your application is defined in Azure Active Directory. And then it supports consuming the web APIs that are offered to you by Azure Active Directory. And again, built with Angular in mind, so there are two JavaScript libraries, Angular.js and Angular, JS that you need to set references to in order to use this. All right, so as I said, the key thing here about AngularJS is it allows you to create an Angular application that engages in OAuth security flow using a modified flow known as implicit flow. The big difference between implicit flow and standard OAuth flow is that implicit flow says, I'm willing to give you an access token for the resource that you're making a request for based solely on the login of the user. So in other words, under implicit flow, if you wanted Facebook to tweet for you, basically what happens is you're going to log in to Facebook, and the act of logging into Facebook, the act of providing those credentials are recognized by the token provider. In this case, it's going to be Azure Active Directory. And it's going to say, listen, because Scott trusted Facebook enough to log in, or this application that wants to tweet to log in, because I recognize that he logged in successfully, that's enough for me. I'm going to hand a token over that will allow the tweeting to occur. So basically what implicit flow does is allows an application to do something for you without requiring that specific client secret to be sent over, because, hey, JavaScript can't defend that client secret anyway. We can give ourselves a little bit of a visual on this just by sort of looking at the different players involved in OAuth here. So when we're talking about OAuth, right, the whole idea behind OAuth is that you have a broker known as the authorization server that is working to allow two entities that don't really trust each other to work together. So in this case, what we have are really four actors involved in the OAuth flow. The first is the end user. That's the person who would like to have an app do something for them. The second is the client, and the client is the untrusted app that wants to do something. The third is the resource server, and that's the place where we want to access. And then again, the fourth is the authorization server that's arranging trust. So in this case, for our little example here with implicit flow, let's change our scenario a bit. And let's say that we have written an app and it runs in an Azure website, so it's our client. And our client wants to reach into SharePoint and grab a document, grab a Word document that we point out to it, and take that Word document and publish it as a web page, right? So it wants to be able to do this work for us, but it needs permission to reach into our SharePoint online and retrieve the document. So the way the flow works is that first the end user is going to go into that app. So the end user resource owner contacts the client, so the end user talking to the add-in or the app that we wrote that runs in Azure. Then what happens is the AngularJS libraries are loaded and initialized. Then the end user is redirected to Azure Active Directory and prompted to sign in. The act of signing in to Azure Active Directory is enough trust for Azure Active Directory to then issue an access token back to the Azure website, to the client application. That client application can then make an AJAX call that's initiated through Angular's HTTP service, but ultimately intercepted by the AngularJS library. And then what it does is it attaches the required access token to that call. And then from there, we can return the value back after making a CORS REST call back to the application. In this case, it could be our Word document, which then the application does something with. If you're interested in using AngularJS with Angular, then what you're going to have to do is create a new Azure Active Directory application. Again, this is all designed to work within the Microsoft realm. So we're talking about AngularJS as the basis for development. We're talking about Azure Active Directory as the basis for security. AngularJS is the library that you're using. And then after we create our application definition in Azure Active Directory, we'll go ahead and create a new empty ASP.NET application with references to ADL.js. And I'll show you some of that after we do a look at the actual application in action. So let's go ahead and switch back over to demo, and I'll show you an example. Oh, okay, got to share. Okay, so I'm going to return to the same developer tenancy that I've been using here. And I'm going to come up to the app launcher, drop this thing down. And what we're going to do is come over to OneDrive. So I'll click on OneDrive. And I just want to show you that I've got a bunch of PowerPoint decks in here. So a bunch of presentations that I've just uploaded into my OneDrive. And now all I want to do is create an application that's able to read these out and display them. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to have to do is to come into Azure Active Directory and set up a new definition for my application. Here inside of my Azure Azure tenancy, I can come down here to Active Directory, where we'll see I have one entry. And if I click on that entry here, and then click on Applications, you can see I have an application definition in here called ADL Angular. This is the application definition I'm using for the demo. And if I go ahead and click on that application and say configure, we'll see some interesting information. So you can see my sign-on URL here for localhost. So I'm actually going to run this application locally and log into it right from Visual Studio. You can see my client ID here. Basically, in Azure Active Directory, applications are first-class principals, just like people. So just like people have a user ID, a password, and privileges, so does the application, except we call the user ID the client ID. And then the password is down here in the keys section, where you can create new passwords called client secrets for your application. Now in our case, since we're using implicit flow, we won't actually need to reference the key, only the client ID. Once the application is in place, you can slide down to the bottom where you can set up permissions for the application. You can see here that I have permissions for Office 365 SharePoint Online, and there are several here to pick from. Now I've just got them all checked for demo, but you can see all the different permissions that an app could have if it wanted to access Office 365. If we come into Add Application, you can see that this system goes beyond simply Office 365. We also have the new unified APIs, there's Power BI, and there's management services in here as well. So there are lots of different permissions that your application can request inside of Azure Active Directory. And I think this is a really key thing, because what you're looking at in many ways is the future of development in the cloud, registering applications with Azure Active Directory and then accessing the permissions here, granting permissions to that application. The last thing that you need to do is to specifically allow the use of implicit flow, and that's done by modifying the manifest for this application. So the Boolean value that turns on implicit flow is not exposed within the user interface. What you have to do is download the actual manifest file, and inside the manifest file there's a Boolean value that allows you to turn on implicit flow permission. If we come back to Visual Studio here, I can go ahead and open a file up here, and here's the actual manifest right here, downloaded and saved. And you can see that it has a setting, allow implicit flow, which I've changed to true and then uploaded back into Azure Active Directory. Once you've got that in place, you've then given permission for your application to access and use implicit flow. The next thing to do is to actually set up your Angular application to use implicit flow. And so here we're going to take a look at the configuration of my Angular application. So here I've created a new Angular application called My App. and you can see that I'm using the ADL Angular module. That ADL Angular module is available to me because I have set references to the ADL.js and ADL-AngularJS libraries. So then in my configuration, I can use the ADL Angular module, and then I can also utilize the ADL Authentication Service Provider. And then what I'll do is initialize the provider by setting the information about my tenancy, the client ID of the application that I want to use. This is the one we just set up. And then the endpoints that I want to talk to. In our case, I'm interested in talking to this endpoint right here, which is the endpoint that is going to allow me access to my files in OneDrive. If we then look at services, we can set up the services to make calls using the HTTP service right here and actually retrieve the files. So you can see that in Angular, all you do is use the HTTP service, but what's going to happen is ADL.js is going to make sure that an authentication token is attached to this call. All right, so you set it up in Azure Active Directory, you configure your application in ADL.js, and then you use the HTTP service. Let's go ahead and run this thing and see how it works. Okay, so when I fire up the application, it's going to go ahead and start on my home page here, and you can see that it has me logged in as Scott at spsnyc.onmicrosoft.com. And this is my organizational ID from the developer tenancy that I've been using. The reason that I'm logged in is because if we look at the Angular router, you can see that within the routes, I've provided this additional flag that says require AD login, and it's set to true. So if I wasn't previously logged in, it's going to take me through a login cycle where I'm going to have to sign in, and it might also take me through a consent dialog asking if it's okay for the application to read my files. In any case, once you're logged in, then it's a simple matter of just making those HTTP calls from Angular. And you can see here, for example, I click on Documents, and sure enough, it's able to go off and read all of the documents from my OneDrive, showing that this application, which is running in Visual Studio on localhost, is able to use implicit OAuth Flow and an Angular application to reach in and talk to any of the things that it had permission to talk to. So I think this is pretty cool and pretty important stuff for you to know. But I also think what's really important about this is to just understand that this is really getting at the future of development here, because we're doing something that, great that I'm talking to OneDrive, but I can also talk to all kinds of other Microsoft products here, as we had pointed out, right? So we expect, as time goes by, that when we're inside of Azure Active Directory, increasingly what's going to happen is we're going to see more and more permissions land in Azure Active Directory, so that you can do things like get into OneNote, OneDrive, Yammer, you name it. All the different products and services that your application might want to use, you're going to expect to find under your application definition when you click on Configure and scrolling down to the bottom and looking at all the various permissions that are available. So get used to this type of development. If you're doing Angular already, great. Let's go ahead and add ADL.js to what you're doing. If you're not doing it, it's another great reason to learn Angular development. All right, let's go ahead and jump back then to our slides and take a look at the last tool that we want to talk about. Okay, the last thing I want to do is talk a little bit about Angular and SharePoint hybrid solutions. So what do I mean by that? Well, when it comes to Angular and SharePoint, we have some challenges. First of all, AngularJS is a single page application or SPA framework. So the idea behind a SPA framework is you're supposed to sit on one page, and that page changes the way it looks as JavaScript runs in the background. Unfortunately, though, SharePoint itself is not a single page application. It's a multi-page application. So it means that when you're merging Angular and SharePoint together, you can find yourself in situations where sometimes the user's in a single page application and sometimes they're not. And this might happen because we used a web part, like I showed you in the beginning, that's kind of sitting on a page. Or it might happen because what we want to do is take advantage of some of the things that SharePoint has to offer without redoing them. So a good example of that is a SharePoint list. So a SharePoint list is a great back-end data store for lots of add-ins that you might create. Simple, easy to use, already has a user interface that allows CRUD operations, so why not use them? Unfortunately, in your Angular applications, if you leave the Angular application to say, go add a new item to a list, then you're exiting that SPA framework and you're going to SharePoint. And then when you come back, the SPA framework starts all over again. So the option then, if you wanted to stay in the SPA framework, would be to rewrite all the CRUD applications against that list so that you provide the edit view, the new view, all those things that the list provides automatically. Unfortunately, that's a lot of additional work for you to get into. So that may not be what you want. You may actually want to take advantage of the user interface that's already in place with SharePoint lists. Well, in that case, what you'd like to do really is try to make those lists work a little bit better with Angular so they're not just two separate environments. And the place where they kind of meet is in JSLink. So JSLink is a tool for modifying the user interfaces of SharePoint lists. And we've done that before where we've used JSLink maybe outside of Angular. But now what we'd like to do is we'd like to be able to use JSLink with Angular specifically so that we can modify the look and feel of SharePoint lists and get these two to sort of work a little bit better together. So one of the ways that you might think about doing this, because if you use JSLink, we have to have a JavaScript file that is the JSLink file. It has to be uploaded into the site. It has to be bound to various web parts in order to work. And so it might occur to you that, hey, maybe I could try creating an Angular factory to make that work. Angular factories are a very popular piece of the Angular framework. And basically what an Angular factory does is it allows you to create functionality that spans different controllers. So you can create common functionality that can be used by different controllers. But what we'd like to do is have sort of a super factory, if you will, a factory that would allow us to configure the JSLink on SharePoint lists when our add-in initializes. And so what we're looking at doing, instead of creating a factory, is to create something called a provider. So the last tool I want to introduce you to for your Angular SharePoint development is the AngularjsLink Provider. The AngularjsLink Provider is an Angular provider that I wrote that specifically allows you to take JSLink files, upload them, and bind them to various lists during the configuration portion of your Angular application. So what it allows you to do is make SharePoint lists work a little bit better with Angular applications and make it so you're not doing something that's completely separate from each other. And that saves you from having to rewrite all of the CRUD operations against your SharePoint lists using Angular. You can see here on the slide, the provider is pretty straightforward. It has two functions in it. The first one is site admin, and the second is set JSLink. So the site admin function is designed to determine whether or not the current user is a site administrator. This is important because the JSLink is only going to be able to be uploaded and bound to the lists by a site administrator. So what it means is that in order for your application to work correctly, the first person who uses it has to be a site administrator. After the binding takes place, anybody can use it. But that's usually okay, because when you think about adding an add-in into a SharePoint site, that can only be done by an administrator anyway. So the idea is the administrator adds the add-in to the SharePoint site, and then the binding takes place, and from there on, everybody can take advantage of the changes that are made by the provider to the SharePoint lists. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at an example of that tool in action. Okay, we'll go ahead and share again, and let me go ahead and open the project here so that we have the code available to talk about. Debug, stop debugging, and here's the one we want right here. Okay, and I'm going to show you this in action before we talk about any of the code. Let's go ahead and go back to that tenancy that we were talking about here before. So this is going to be sharepoint.com/sites appdev, like that. Okay, so here's the tenancy I was in before. Now, what I've got is an add-in that I created here, very simple add-in, just called JSLink module, right? So pretty simple. Basically, all it is an add-in that has a task list on it. So all I want to do to make it really simple is just take an existing task list that's part of my SharePoint add-in and modify the %complete field so it shows the classic progress bar that we've seen in a lot of examples of JSLink. So again, the idea is I want to write an Angular application, but I want to leverage SharePoint lists in my Angular application, and I want to modify the way they look so that I don't have to rewrite that UI in Angular. Now, I'm going to go back here and launch this application again, and I want you to watch as I do this in the lower right-hand corner. Let's go ahead and launch the add-in, and when I do, my provider is going to run, and down here in the bottom you can see that it just popped up with the message saying that the JSLink was set. So that's the idea, is that during the configuration of the application, the JSLink file gets uploaded to the task list or any other list, or as many lists as you want, and then performs the modification as part of the Angular initialization. If I then go look at the task list, we can in fact see here's a task on there, and there's the good old progress bar right there showing 50% complete. Now, I've done something very simple here. I've used JSLink to modify the normal presentation of the %complete from a number to a progress bar. But I think you can see that this would allow you to make all kinds of modifications and therefore keep as much of the built-in SharePoint UI as you want as part of your Angular application. Let's go look at the code that made this happen. So in order to make this happen, I've gone ahead and created a new Angular application. Here it is, called My App. And I am adding in the JSLink module. Here in the JSLink library, this is the definition of my JSLink module. So you can see it has the two methods, isSiteAdmin and setJSLink. There's a lot going on in here. The isSiteAdmin makes calls over to SharePoint to determine your permissions, and the setJSLink goes through the entire process of uploading files, checking them in, and applying them to web parts. The actual JSLink that we want to apply can be found over here as well. Here's the JSLink, the progress bar JSLink, and this is just a very simple JSLink file. So what I'm saying here is that the JSLink is actually part of my add-in. So now we can see that during the configuration portion, I have the injection of the JSLink service provider, and I can come down here and say JSLink Service Provider is site admin. If you are the site admin, then what I'm going to do is set the JSLink. I give the name of the list that I want to set it on, whether it's the view, the edit, or the new form that I'm updating, and a reference to the JSLink that should be bound to it. And that's all it takes. And now this Angular application, during its configuration process, is going to go ahead and bind JSLink to whatever lists that you provide. And you can do one, or you can do a dozen lists here as part of your initialization process. Okay, let's go ahead and jump back to slides here and kind of wrap up. So the point of what I'm showing you here, what I wanted to do today, was to talk about 3 different tools that you can use in your Angular SharePoint development. The first one was the CDN Manager. And again, we've got a link for the CDN Manager available for you right here on the resources for the show. And you can download that CDN Manager, and you can make a reference to the Angular library. And then very simply, you can create anything from an Angular web part all the way through an add-in that uses Angular without having to worry about managing the references to those CDNs. The second thing that we talked about was the implicit OAuth Flow. Implicit OAuth Flow with your SharePoint Office 365 Angular development is important because it allows you to use a JavaScript framework like Angular and engage in the OAuth process, which is critical for being able to trust apps in the cloud. And finally, I showed you the AngularjsLink Provider, which allows you to take JSLink files and during the configuration process of your Angular application, go ahead and make changes to SharePoint lists, which should allow you to preserve those lists and not have to rewrite a bunch of CRUD UI for them. Okay, so we can take a quick look here and see if there are any questions running around before we close it out here. Let's see. Just taking a quick browse here. So somebody's asking how we deploy the CDN Manager to Office 365. It's very straightforward. When you access the CDN Manager, you're going to find it's available to you as a WSP. So you would do it in the normal way, which typically means uploading it into your catalog in Office 365 and then deploying from there. And yes, I'm pretty excited about it myself. I think it solves a bunch of problems. And in all cases, for all 3 of these things that I talked about, I've written articles on the IT Unity website. Again, the links will take you to those articles so you can read more about it and get links to the actual code downloads. All right, great. Well, I think we're at the point where we're just about ready to wrap up. So again, I want to thank you for spending the time with me here and talking a little bit about Angular development. Also, again, I want to point out, make sure you guys know, 2 weeks from now is our next show. Andrew's promised to be with us for that next show where we're going to again talk about Angular, but this time Office add-ins in Angular. And also, once again, I want to give a big thanks to Microsoft for their sponsorship of this. They do so much for us here at IT Unity and so much for all of us in the development community. Thanks, guys. Really, really appreciate it. And that's it for me. I'm all done. I'll see you guys next time.